Hi, and welcome back to another episode of my podcast, Missionary Life. I am so thrilled to be here with you, and I am giddy to have Rachel Pieh Jones here with me. I'm an admirer of her writing for a long time. We're discussing faith, mystery, and culture shock as expats and missionaries. And we're going to see how the intersection of faith and our culture meld, how we navigate these difficult transitions and other faith beliefs like Islam while deconstructing and reconstructing our own faith. I've always believed there's more than we know to faith. There's a mystery that permeates God and our experience of Him. From Muslim to Christian to Buddhist follower, how does God reveal Himself to us, and why do we believe we're the only ones who've experienced the real God? How do we live within the mystery and the culture shock of being welcomed into other nations? So, hi,
Hi, great
Rachel.
to be here.
Yeah, I'm so excited to have you here. So I'm just going to give your bio real quick because it's an awesome bio. So Rachel Pieh Jones is an accomplished author with 4 books, the most recent being Pillars, and a popular blog called Djibouti Jones. And her mission is to help expatriates live their best life possible. Rachel writes about life at the crossroads of faith, culture for the New York Times, Christianity Today, and more. She's lived in Somalia and Djibouti since moving to Africa in 2003. And recently she completed 2 seminary degrees, and her husband and her moved back to the United States. So,
Thanks.
welcome. And so, my number one question to start off this podcast, Rachel, is I know that you have talked about this distinction between, expat and missionary. Can you explain what that means to you?
Yeah, so my husband and I work for an organization called Resource Exchange International, and it is not explicitly officially faith based. And yet, ourselves, we're Christian.
Mm-hmm.
We're deeply motivated by our personal
Right.
faith, by our commitment to the Bible and our love for Jesus. And yet we try to couple that spiritual personal conviction with professional contribution. So our organization focuses on sending people with professional skills, doctors, teachers, business people, all over the world to partner with local governments or local organizations with what they have identified as a local need. And so
Mm-hmm.
when you're a Christian doing that kind of work internationally, cross culturally, usually in places where there's low development or high economic need, or just
Mm-hmm.
a real desire on the part of the local leaders to grow and to partner with outside resources. When you couple that with a Christian faith, then the word missionary is
Yeah.
usually what people assume. And yet,
Mm-hmm.
there's just a slight distinction between, a church, someone who's working as a pastor, for example, or an international seminary
Right.
professor or an evangelist versus someone who is really doing a professional skill with
Right.
also a faith motivation. And so we have not used that term missionary ourselves when we've been abroad. And yet when we come back to the US, that's kind of the only category that a lot of Christians have for someone like us. And so I understand like
Right.
people can use either term to refer to us because I do love talking about spiritual
Sure.
things. It's one of my deep passions actually. And so I get that. And then so our organization has like my husband has a PhD in organizational development and education. So he worked in
Mm-hmm.
education and things like that, which is
Yeah.
a little bit of a distinction between maybe being a pastor. It's not a hierarchical distinction. I
Yeah.
want to be clear about that. It's just a
Right.
different,
Yeah.
slightly different emphasis.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. So it's an expat, someone who has a professional skill set that they are bringing to the field, and they are going there not just to hand out tracts or preach the gospel, but really to serve a community with a particular
Yeah,
need.
yeah.
Okay. Perfect. Okay. Thank you for sharing that. So I want to just dive right into this quote that I really loved from your new book, Pillars. You said, learning led to more questions and a craving to dig deeper. Does a Christian need to call God God? And what do we mean by God? Is Allah the same as the God of the Bible? Can a Christian pray while facing Mecca or with a headscarf on? At first, I answered these questions with certainty. God is God's name. Allah is not God. Christians shouldn't face Mecca. These perfunctory answers became unsatisfactory. And when I looked at Jesus in the New Testament and developed relationships with Muslims, old answers crumbled like the walls of Jericho. For the first time in my life, I was terrified. I might not have all the answers. I might not even be asking the right questions. What if faith certainty is certainty and mystery? What if God is beyond knowing, full of surprise and inscrutability, yet also tangibly revealed in Jesus? These questions scared me. I didn't understand it then, but this was when my life of faith truly began. That's such a beautiful sentiment. And I would love for you just to describe what this process of sort of deconstructing your old beliefs of Christianity and faith and then reconstructing to this new place looked like for you.
You know, when I was young, growing up in a Christian family, a pretty homogenous environment, it was very easy to have black and white ideas of everybody,
Yeah.
and to identify people like me as kind of in and everyone else as out. And that applied to a lot of my faith ideas. And then I started to encounter people who had very different faith ideas in a very robust and meaningful way. And I kind of had this thought like, it's simplistic, I know, but that everyone's just waiting to hear about Jesus. And as soon as they hear this beautiful story, that's what they're going to want, because that's what they've been waiting for, because that's what's true and good. And I do believe that that is what is true and good. But this idea that other people have something else that they are deeply convicted about and hold to meaningfully wasn't something that I engaged with in a very deep and profound way until really engaging with and being immersed in a Muslim community. I haven't really used the word deconstruction or reconstruction specifically, but essentially it was a lot of that, of just asking bigger questions, being more curious, deeper questions about my own faith convictions as I started to encounter people with different faith convictions. So it's pretty easy to hold to your faith when everyone around you thinks the same thing. But when you are the minority, and all of a sudden, you know, people are, my friends, people who love me, are saying, you should become a Muslim because we love you and we want you to be part of our community in this way. I had to deeply reinterrogate, why do I believe these things about Jesus? Why do I think that this stuff is true? And what is that going to look like as I practice my faith in this context, where what I do looks strange to other people, and the things that I believe are, you know, not what they hold to. And so by asking those different questions, I started to experience God in different ways. I started to look around and see, oh, my Muslim friends are praying 5 times a day, sincerely, and I'm not. Or they're they're fasting for a whole month, and I don't fast for a whole month. And so what can I learn from their faith practice that can actually inform my own? Not that I have to do things the same way. Not that I have to, you know, go to the mosque or fast specifically for Ramadan, but can I learn from the idea of a faithful ritual commitment to spiritual practice, a community involvement that does it together? And then you know, looking into my own Christian heritage, we have those practices. I just didn't grow up with them. Things like Lent, pilgrimage, you know, corporate practices of faith. So all that was kind of happening around me, and I'm looking at my own faith and deconstructing essentially the rigid boundaries that I had and the rigid ways that I had of practicing Christianity. And thinking more with curiosity, with exploration, with humility, and then learning to see what could I learn from someone else who doesn't agree with me, but I can still learn from them and incorporate that into my own faith. So that's a rather rambling answer, but it took many years.
No, it's good. Of course, I love that. I think it's a really beautiful idea. And I think you're not alone. I think a lot of Christians that enter these different faith contexts, you know, in missions and ministry, you know, you're forced to reckon, you know, with your beliefs, maybe the beliefs you've held as a child. And all of a sudden, you know, you're exploring, well, how do my Muslim brothers and sisters practice faith? And wow, look at the way they love each other. There's beauty in that. And there's mystery there. Do you have a personal story of maybe a friend, like a Muslim friend or community that sort of helped you enter into this new thought process?
One particular friend, and she features pretty strongly in Pillars, just a beautiful
Mm-hmm.
woman and friendship that we had over the years. I'm so thankful for her. Um,
Mm.
there's a couple of stories I could share. One specifically, I went to her home after her aunt had been on pilgrimage on Hajj to Mecca, which is a really big deal.
Mm-hmm.
And so they had this kind of Hajj party afterwards when she came home. And so
Mm-hmm.
they invited me to come. And they bring back, often the pilgrims will bring back from Mecca a bucket of water from the well of Zamzam, which they believe is where,
Wow.
when Hagar and Ishmael were in the desert and they were dying of thirst, that God provided this well. And
Yes.
so it's kind of this miraculous water that's ever flowing in the desert, which is miraculous and very life giving and healing. So they often will
Mm.
bring back kind of a jug from that water, the well. And at this party,
Okay.
they passed around a tray of little cups that all the women were drinking from, and it was this water from the well of Zamzam. And the women were just so
Wow.
thrilled to be drinking it. They're pouring it over their heads. They're, drinking it. And I didn't know what to do when it
Mm.
came to me because I'd never been to a party like this before. And then I was thinking also, I know my Christian community in the U.S., some, not everyone, but some might question, should I drink this? Is this kind of
Mm.
is this syncretistic? Is this an evil practice? Something because it's not our religion, it's a different
Mm-hmm.
religion.
Right.
So should I actually,
Mm-hmm.
put this water into my body and engage in this ritual with the women? So I'm wrestling with this, like, what am I going to do? What am I going to
Yes.
do? And the question, what would Jesus do? Right? It's very cliche, but what should I do as a
Yeah.
Jesus follower?
Yeah. You're like, is this demonic? Oh
Yeah,
God.
yeah. I mean, I didn't feel like it was, but I'm often wondering what are people going
Right.
to think if I do this and then tell them about it.
Sure.
And then the tray had come around, and my friend, she knew I didn't know what to do with it, and so someone else had like snatched the last glass from the tray, and then my friend said, no, give some to Rachel, and just like dumped it on me, and then yeah,
I
yeah,
gotcha.
right, and then I drank some, and I thought, if again, just to be cliche, but if Jesus was in this room, I think he would participate. I think that I'm filled with the Holy
Yeah.
Spirit. I can discern with the help of the Holy Spirit in me what is right and what is wrong. And for me in this situation, it was the right thing to participate with these women's celebration. And it
Yes.
wasn't me saying, I believe that there's healing power in this water. It wasn't me saying, I agree with all these things. It was me saying, I love my community. And I'm so thankful that you've welcomed me in as an
Yes.
outsider, which is hard to do. It's
Mm.
hard to love the outsider. I speak
Yeah.
with an accent. I
It
eat strange
is.
food. I don't know what to do at things like this. It's hard to love the outsider. And so
Mm-hmm.
this woman, my friend in particular, and her whole family had loved me so well for many years at that point that I felt like
Mm.
I think it's honoring to participate in this. And so that was a way
Yes.
of me recognizing that in this, I'm trusting God in this, and I'm expressing my gratitude to my community as an outsider, as a minority. And that
Mm.
means a lot to me in my faith practice of how to love my neighbor and how to be loved by my neighbor. And my
Yeah.
friend even said,
That's
we know
really
you're not
stunning.
becoming a Muslim. We just like being with you.
Yeah. That's so beautiful. And that's just really who Jesus is. He went as a, brown-skinned Jewish boy, and he entered into the cultures, and he loved, the Samaritan woman. He loved, all the people around him in his community. And I think that really is representative of him. And that's really what we're called to do. And yet so often as Christians, we have this strange fear of other cultures, other religions, like somehow, it's going to infiltrate us. And I really think that it's such a beautiful practice that you were able to be a part of that community and be welcomed in. And I love that. So I want to ask, you speak of your life in Somalia and now living, in the US and I think Missouri, you said, and some of the terrorist Islamophobia and white saviorism, you've witnessed. Can you tell me how American nationalism has hurt, the communities and Muslim people that you've come to love, and what it's like to live in this tension now that you live in
So
America?
Minnesota, not Missouri. Yeah, it's colder
Minnesota,
here.
sorry. I always get the
Yeah,
M's
yeah, we're
confused.
we're cold and snowy up here. So my experience with things like Islamophobia has been different because I've spent the last 20 years in a Muslim majority country. And so some of those ideas have been only things that I've heard when we come back to the U.S., maybe for the summertime, for a vacation.
Okay.
I would hear
Yep.
things, there's a lot of Somalis in Minnesota, and they've moved out from just being in the city. They're moving into more rural communities. They're just really establishing themselves as Americans and in lots of different places of work. And so I would hear people say, there are so many Muslims at the Target that I'm afraid to go there. Or and those
Yeah.
things happened, I would say, several years ago. Those kinds of comments that I'm afraid of this community and I don't know how to engage with them, and I'm afraid. And I feel like I've seen a little bit of a shift. This isn't directly answering your question about nationalism, but I have noticed that people
Yeah.
now are more asking. There's a lot of Muslims around. How do I love them well? I feel like I have seen a shift.
That's good.
One woman said a Muslim family moved across the street, and can you give me some ideas for how to welcome them into the community? They want to know things that they shouldn't do that would cause offense, like serving a ham or something, pork product. And so,
Yeah.
and it could just be
Right.
my limited experience right now, but I have seen more of an interest in, we don't actually want to be afraid anymore because they're not going anywhere. I think they're seeing the Somalis are really becoming American. They're staying,
Yeah,
they're
they're
rooting
staying.
themselves into the community. So how do we love them well? At the same time, there are still some of these comments. And so I was recently on
Yes.
a Zoom call with a group of women, and one of them said, well, we all know that Detroit is under Sharia law. And so, she had some things to say about that. And I said, okay, pause. I was leading a discussion. I want to push back on this idea of Detroit being under Sharia law. And do you know what Sharia law is? And she didn't. And then explaining, like, actually,
Yeah.
it's not. Women are not being stoned for adultery. No one's hands are being cut off. No one is having multiple wives in Detroit, these kinds of ideas. And so there are still these misconceptions that I hear. And yet when
Yes.
I do it, when I handle it in that way of like, okay, pause, I want to gently challenge you on this. And then asking questions, not saying, hey, that is totally inappropriate and wrong.
Right.
And making the person feel ashamed for
Right.
saying that. That's not helpful. But saying, do you understand what that means when you say that? And trying to help her think through her own process of where that idea came from. What does she actually know about it? And then she kind of came to her own conclusion of, oh, I guess they're not. And what does that mean about my own ideas about Islam or people? So those things do
Yeah.
exist out there. But I think it takes a lot, just being gentle and challenging in a way that can help someone come to their own conclusion that is more accurate, I think is a good way to
Yeah.
approach it.
Well, I'm glad you could, be a witness for her about, the true nature of Islam and the distinctions, between these things, with your experience. With living in Somalia, what are some of the beautiful aspects or gifts that you feel like you've received as an expat living in that community? Anything that you took away with you that you really treasure?
So many things. A lot of them,
I
a
know.
lot of them have been about the ways that I have learned to reread or re-understand scripture in some ways, which was a big surprise. This idea
Yeah.
of, okay, Christians talk a lot about loving our neighbor. We love the story of the Good Samaritan, especially people who are involved in development and humanitarian work. The story of the Good Samaritan is very powerful, and we often think we're the Good Samaritan, or maybe we're the person walking by,
Right.
the Good Samaritan who's wounded on the road, and the priests and the different spiritual leaders walk by, and then the Good Samaritan, the enemy, comes by and cares for this wounded man.
Right.
And so the question becomes for the American Christian, are you the one who walks by, or are you the one who stops and engages and helps your neighbor? Well, I discovered and experienced by being the one often who was wounded, whether it's I was the outsider. I went through cancer. I had struggles with language. There was sexual harassment. I was the one who felt wounded, and I was the one that people were either walking past or stopping to help. And so the story of the Good Samaritan kind of flipped over and saying, how have I been neighbored well? by people that
Wow.
traditionally would be considered my enemy, Muslim Somali community.
Mm-hmm.
And so it really made me reframe those kinds of stories. Not, I'm not always going to be the giver or the hero of this story. I'm going to be the one in
Yeah.
need. And
Right.
how does that then affect my affection for and relationship with these people who are, like from this American Christian community considered enemies? And so I'm just so thankful
Mm-hmm.
that my eyes have been opened to ways that I
Mm-hmm.
have had a limited reading of Scripture or limited understanding
Yeah.
of global life and the
Mm.
just humanity and culture all over the world, and ways that I can ask different questions to reframe my own understanding. And so there's just been multiple experiences of that. I was in the market one time with a woman that was essentially homeless. She lived in a house, like one room, no electricity, barely a roof. Her
Mm.
husband had given her HIV and several children and left her. And so I was helping her to
Mm.
establish a small tea business. I was buying her supplies in the market, pots and pans and
Mm-hmm.
food and
Mm-hmm.
things like this to sell. And as we're purchasing things, a beggar comes up to us, a person who's begging. A person was blind. They were being led by another person. And they held out their hand
Yeah.
for coins. And I thought, consciously thought in my head, I'm already giving so much to a woman in need. And it wasn't even that much. It was barely
Mm.
$100. That,
Mm-hmm.
that's my kind of good deed for the day. And yet,
Mm-hmm.
while I'm buying these pots and pans, she takes out her coins and gives them to the beggar.
Mm.
And that's all she had for the day.
Yeah.
It was the total cost of a bus ride to get her home. And
Mm.
I thought, oh my gosh, there's a story like that in the Bible where this
Yeah.
widow gives 2 coins to the temple treasury, and Jesus says she has given
Mm.
more than all these other people who had come by giving larger amounts. And so those
Yeah.
kinds of experiences just made my faith come alive and made me really convicted, first of all, personally, in that experience, but then also turned those stories that I'd read for years and years growing up in a Christian home, made them come alive
Mm-hmm.
with reality and with
Yeah.
sense, with smell and sight and sound to kind of go along with that story.
Mm.
So things like that I'm just so thankful for. I'm thankful for the friends who loved us well. I gave birth there. Like I said, I went through cancer, and
Mm.
the care that I received in those kind of circumstances was incredible. And so I'm really, really thankful.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really amazing. I had that experience as well in Uganda where, you as the helper become the one being helped. And it can be kind of uncomfortable at first, to receive this love and this care. But, I went through definitely several illnesses there and infertility and all these things that happened to me, miscarriage. And I just felt the love and support of my Ugandan friends there. And it's just so sweet to be loved, especially because sometimes different cultures have different methods and practices and ways they love you that maybe even speak more volumes, than our traditional American ways. I find that a lot of Ugandans, they knew how to sit with pain, they knew how to sit with grief, they knew how to sit with suffering. They weren't afraid of it, or they weren't, made uncomfortable by it. They would just be there with me, and that's something that we tend to we lose sometimes in our Western society. So um, yeah, we touched on a little bit in our conversations about the white savior complex, and I know that you've talked about it before. And can you tell me where you saw some of that playing out, where you were serving in Somalia, and maybe some of the dangers of that?
Yeah, so it's that idea of putting yourself as the white foreigner, white American to the center of the story, and the one who's leading and making decisions
Mm,
and kind of being the hero in some way. So just like we've talked
yeah.
about, that turning it upside down by being the one in need is part of dismantling
Mm,
that idea and even starting to recognize it. Oh, this
mhm.
feels weird. Why does this feel weird to be served? That is
Yeah.
part of that figuring
Yeah.
out. Yeah,
I don't
yeah.
like it.
So yeah, we see that a lot, and I've seen it in my own heart unintentionally, and need to dismantle it there over and over. A very clear example of what this looks like and the damage it can cause happened with a running group that I had helped to start several years ago. There was a bunch of girls from low income families and Often their clothing was torn or they were barefoot as would come to the running practice. And we practiced on this hillside.
Yeah.
And one day I was there with the coaches, and this two cars drive up, and I think they were maybe military contractors. I am not sure. They were American, bunch of white guys, and they just drive up and they came over to me because I'm the white person they can communicate with. Although the coaches did speak very good English, but they came to me and they said, "Hey, are these girls poor?" I was like, "Hold on a
Oh
second
God.
here."
Wow, so much
Right?
tact
Can
you
we
have.
can you ask us maybe what we're doing or what's going on? And so I didn't answer the question. I said, this is
Yeah.
a girls running club. Our focus is on keeping girls in school, and they come for training, and this just kind of giving them some history. And they're like, yeah, but are they poor? And I was like, that doesn't really seem to matter, or it shouldn't matter. And then they said, well, we have a bunch of Gatorade and some soccer balls that they wanted to give out to the girls. And so the whole thing just became very chaotic. Some kids came running around. There's also a bunch of boys
Yeah.
around who watched the practice, and they came running over to get this
Right.
Gatorade. The girls had gone for a run, and the ones who came back late didn't get the Gatorade, and it just devolved into
Yeah. It's
free
just
for
like
all
a free
chaos.
for all.
They had some soccer balls. They gave the kids the
Yeah.
soccer balls. They just were fighting over them. So me and the other coaches had grabbed all this stuff and tried to put it back in my car so we could lock it and maybe use it. Like, it would be great to use those resources as motivations or team
Right.
prizes, or we could have partnered. They could have partnered with this team, with the coaches, the local coaches, to use those resources well. But they wanted to do this good deed with photos, so they're taking pictures with the kids and all this stuff, and then they just drove away, and with their pictures,
Yeah.
having felt like they did a great thing for the day. And the team practice that one day in particular just totally was an absolute disaster. It ended badly. The kids started fighting,
Yeah.
like fist fighting. We had to cancel practice for a couple of days. The boys started making threats against the girls that they were going to rape them if they didn't give them soccer balls.
Oh
It was just a
gosh.
huge mess. And so, yeah, it
Just
was just a
disaster.
very clear example of someone coming in, doing a good deed, and not paying attention to the repercussions, not having done the prior
Right.
necessary research to investigate. Didn't have to be a lot. It could have just been a conversation with the coaches. But often this outsider comes in without having done the necessary pre-work to find out what's happening already. How can I
Yeah.
partner with the local leaders and contribute in a way that will be meaningful and not
Exactly.
damaging, and then leaving without seeing the the consequence of that behavior. And so, yeah, I mean, that
Right.
happens far too often a lot. And
A
so
lot.
for me, a way that I try to encourage people to counter that is, first of all, become aware of it in your own heart. Are you looking to be the hero? How can you be served? And
Yeah.
examining, like what we've already talked about, that feeling of uncomfortability, but then also doing the necessary work. Because when we come in as a foreigner, and we're going to, even if it's education, if it's medical, it can all be good, but we are interfering in people's lives
Yes.
with this outside presence, and we're not going to stay here forever. We're going to leave again. And so we have to do the research to understand the local culture and values and leaders, and then looking for a partner that we can
Yeah.
really just bless and push, without getting the accolades and the glory ourselves. So that, yeah, like that's
Right.
just one thing that has to happen ahead of time.
Yeah.
Looking for a partner.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Sorry. I've seen this so much in Uganda because it was a very, aid centric place in Gulu where I lived. And, my favorite debacle that happened was, I think it was Gerard Butler. I forget. It was like some movie star. They decided they wanted to hand out video cameras to the kids to have them film their own lives. And, you know, not to mention they didn't know how to use them, and they didn't have like the right charging, ports for them and all these things. It's just a disaster. And, kids are fighting over these things, and they're selling them for alcohol, and, and they don't stick around to see, what's going to happen or how this is actually going to benefit the community in any way. It's just a way to assuage their, white guilt, or, make them feel better about themselves. But, like what that guy said, are these girls poor? Like, when you put your other people as the victim and you as the hero, you become in some ways like an oppressor, and so it really is sad, and it is rampant. And I think that exactly what you're saying, like education, research, putting yourself in the position of a learner, not going outside the scope of what your abilities are, like not offering skill sets that you don't have, getting trained in things that are actually going to help the community. So I think all
I think
that's really
also a lot of
important.
it comes down to not forcing them into our categories. So, for example, it'd be very
Hmm.
easy to drive to a particular section of Djibouti City and say, here's a slum. This is where there's just rampant
Hmm.
poverty and devastation. Well, I know
Yeah.
families in that, housing situation, and one of the women in particular has more money in her bank account than we had at the time. She was saving it, and she
Yeah.
just did not. She liked her
Yeah.
life. She did have electricity. She did
Yeah.
have a washing machine, but actually, yeah. So anyway, you could look at her, tin house, and
Right. The
the
outside.
food that she
Hmm.
ate. She liked eating the same food every day. That was very, so and she
Hmm.
felt very wealthy. She had a lot of power and influence in her community because she was one of the more well
Hmm.
off people there. But to label that a slum and to say she needs a handout would be very shaming to her.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. She
Right.
would be
And so
offended
to
by that.
not look at
Yeah.
a category and say, okay, because this doesn't look like the suburban house in Minneapolis with the
Hmm.
green grass lawn and all these different things, they must be poor. And then putting that label on them. And it's
Hmm.
very complicated, but we just have to try to see within their perspective and again, pay attention to what they are identifying as their need or desire or
Yes.
ability to contribute. They all have something
Yes.
to contribute. It might not be economic, it
Hmm.
might not be money, but it might be a language lesson, it might be a cultural insight.
Hmm.
And so there's so many ways for them to
For sure.
contribute.
No, I love that. So you said in your blog, being afraid means engaging with what I'm afraid of. Can you offer some ways that Americans can engage with what they fear, or missionaries that are about to go out to a host country where maybe they're not as open to Christianity, they're not as open to faith? How can we engage with these people that we might look on the outside and think that they're terrorists or be afraid of them? How can we engage lovingly with them?
So I talk a lot about these three words: curiosity, humility, and delight. And I feel like those have been
Mm,
formative for me in my posture of how I try to approach those things that I'm afraid of. How can I be curious about this thing instead of judgmental
hmm.
or jumping to
Hmm.
conclusions? What kind of questions can I ask? And then what humility? What can I learn? How can I be impacted by
Yeah.
this? And then delight. How can I find delight? Like in that water from the well of Zamzam that gets splashed on me. How can I
Yeah.
delight in this situation? And then, a very practical thing that I think people could do is to somehow find someone who maybe knows a little bit more about that place that you're going or the thing you're afraid of, and engage in a safe conversation.
Hmm.
So an example of a group
Hmm.
recently that I think did this really well, when I came back to Minnesota, to the US, I have a friend who works in the medical world here in Minneapolis. And she approached me at a gathering one day and she said, Rachel, during COVID, a number of Christian women started to pray at the hospital where I work in the chapel. And maybe it was after COVID, I guess.
Hmm.
I'm not sure if they could gather during it. But anyway, yeah, it was
Can't
around
pray
that
during
time.
COVID.
Around that time. You can't gather. Anyway, and she
Yeah.
said, we noticed that the only other people who really use the chapel are Muslims. And and she said at first we were a little bit uncertain about that, but thankfully they developed this
Hmm.
idea of how do we connect with them. We are obviously all spiritual here
Hmm.
and care about God, so how can we connect with them? But they were a
Hmm.
little bit afraid, partly to not cause
Yeah.
offense and partly just because of all these different ideas we talked about. And so she asked, hey, could we have a gathering where people just ask you questions about Muslims and get ideas about how
Hmm.
we could engage with them in this chapel? And so we did. It ended up being a Zoom call. And it just was this really beautiful
Hmm.
space with about 12 women all working in the medical world in the same hospital clinic area. And I told them, you can just ask anything. You can, even if you feel like it might be offensive or,
Hmm.
confusing, it's okay. Like they have to have a
Right.
place to ask those questions to someone who can address it. Like the Sharia law
Yeah.
thing, they could ask that to someone else who maybe doesn't know and
Hmm.
get not a great answer, or be
Right. The
afraid to
wrong
ask
answer.
it
Yeah.
because they might feel like, oh, this maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. So I just tried to foster this really
Hmm.
safe space where they could ask different questions, and it was a beautiful conversation. And so I just made it clear to them that there is no question you can ask that's going to be dumb or bad, and challenging the other women in the room. Don't hold it against anybody in the future. If you feel like, that was a silly
Mm-hmm.
question, they should have known the answer or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then being honest about their fears. And so they really were. They
Yeah.
said, I am a little bit intimidated. I'm not sure if it's okay to even, read the Quran or ask different questions about Allah. And
Mm-hmm.
so, yeah, I think finding a place, whether it's a person or a book you can engage with or some way where those questions can come out in a way that they'll be addressed appropriately and answered well, can help just to
Yeah.
dismantle those fears and the misconceptions. And a lot of times we're afraid of what we don't understand. It just contributes to fear. And
Totally.
so once you have, basic knowledge, if it is Islam or maybe it's Buddhism or maybe it's a different political party, having a basic knowledge about that can help to address the fear because it doesn't seem so scary anymore once it becomes approachable.
Mm.
So yeah, find
Yeah.
a safe place to ask questions, do a little bit of research and learn about that thing you're afraid of, and approach it with
Mm-hmm.
those postures of curiosity, humility, and delight.
Really love that. So I want to switch gears a little bit, and I know that you are a mother of twins, and I was curious how you felt about living with your children in this sort of, semi-dangerous, maybe a little bit more hostile environment. And, how did you grapple with that as a mom? And then also, how did you teach your children, to love those that are different from you?
So yeah, twins and also a singleton. I didn't know that word, but yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
Singleton, not to be
right,
forgotten,
right.
the single one.
She's the one that was born there. So partly, the twins were 2 years old when we moved to Somalia, and then the youngest was born there. So for them, it's been pretty natural to grow up in this place where they are the outsider at school or in their community.
Yeah.
So they have been a little bit naturally good at it, although as a parent, it does take some fostering to encourage them.
Yeah.
We intentionally put them in the local school so they could learn French, and so they could really engage
Hmm.
without fear because they didn't understand. Again, not understanding the language would make them very
Yeah.
intimidated. And they learned. We straddled these worlds in Djibouti. Sometimes they were playing with the
Yeah.
ambassador's children. He also, one of them over the years had twins as well who were roughly the same age. And then they're also going
Hmm.
to this running practice with these girls who do come from low income, harsh environments,
Hmm.
sometimes on the same day. And so one of the things that was really important to me as a mom was to enable them to be honest about what they were feeling and experiencing. It can be
Mm.
really, it does really challenge your faith to see people suffer. I don't want to just say there's not
Yes.
poverty. We just, there is, and it's painful. And to see these things
Mm.
happen to people that they care about, or to see, a lot of people on the street with different kinds of, things from birth that are, just
Hmm.
really challenging. The
Yeah.
injustices, the ways that a natural disaster can destroy
Yes.
a tin home.
Mm.
So, so making a space as a parent for the kids to really be honest that this doesn't feel right, and to say yes, this is not
Mm.
what God had planned for our best. There's brokenness in the world, and letting them express that has
Hmm.
been really important. Letting them ask questions about, they would see Muslims praying because especially Muslim men will pray outside if they're in a community and the call to prayer time comes up. So they
Mm.
would see people praying, and to let them ask questions about that. Why are they praying this way? Why don't we pray this way? Really being
Hmm.
honest about the racial differences and allowing them to grieve
Yeah.
the negative things and then to help them celebrate the beautiful things. Those have all been really important to us. And
Yeah.
so I remember making a really intentional point to direct their attention to the birds in our yard, which were really beautiful, colorful,
Hmm.
bright. Everything else is brown. There's no grass, those
Mm.
kinds of things. But helping them to
Yeah.
see the beautiful things has been important at the same time as
Mm.
saying, yes, there is also a pile of trash in the yard or whatever it might be, like the negative thing
Yes.
and the positive thing, and to learn how to hold both. And then to let the
Yeah.
kids sort of tell their own story and helping them to recognize that everybody has a story.
Mm,
You do not know a person by looking at them from the outside. You don't know their story. So
mm,
we were once at this activity, and a woman had said to my youngest, she was probably 6 years old, she was spinning a globe. And the game was to spin the globe and
mm-hmm,
point to the country where you were born. And so my daughter kept turning the
mm-hmm.
globe toward Africa. And the woman would grab it and turn it back and say, no, 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 where you were born, where you were
Right,
born. And
right. She's like, I'm
finally,
African,
yeah, finally I
okay.
said to the woman, look, would you just let her tell you? And the woman was like, okay.
Yeah.
So my daughter spun the globe and touched Djibouti. And she said, I was born in Djibouti. And the woman looked at me like, really?
Mm-hmm,
And I said, yes, she was born in Djibouti.
mm-hmm.
And, and so to just let the kids, to teach my own kids, and also then to have them approach other people with that same idea of, I do not know your story from what you look like. And so
Right.
not jumping to conclusions, not making judgments, but
Mm-hmm.
asking good questions. Asking good questions. It's so important.
Yeah.
So that's been part of our important family
Yeah.
practices, I guess, as a mother for those kids. I'm really proud of them. They're
Yeah.
fantastic.
Yeah. Oh, that's amazing. Yeah. Curiosity is so key in, dealing with other cultures, learning new places. I want to talk a little bit about culture shock because I know that we've both experienced that. And, your life in Djibouti, like, can you tell a little bit of your personal experience and maybe offer some tips or practices to navigate those early days, especially as a woman and a mom of littles?
Everything was super overwhelming. I mean, going from Minneapolis,
Yeah.
Minnesota to a rural village in Somalia was I
Mm.
can't, yeah, I
So
cannot think
hard.
of a bigger contrast. Everything
Mm.
changed. And I remember feeling like when I would walk to the market in the first month or so that I was in a play where I'm wearing a costume. I wore the traditional clothing, I covered my head. I felt like I was
Mm-hmm.
memorizing lines, which I was. I was memorizing Somali language.
Mm-hmm.
So I felt
Yeah.
like I was acting. I learned to walk in a certain way with a sway. And so it
Mm-hmm.
just was really, really, really hard and exhausting. And so I think to give yourself a lot of
Yeah.
grace of understanding that this is exhausting. And even if it doesn't feel like I did anything,
Mm-hmm.
just all that contrast around you wears you down. And so, take care
Yeah.
of yourself, get good
Mm-hmm.
sleep, try to eat well, try to exercise. Those are all things that
Yeah.
I learned to implement. I didn't know that at first. And get help. That was, I'm so thankful that the culture in Djibouti and Somalia involves hiring help,
Yeah.
whether it's a housekeeper, a nanny, a
Mm-hmm.
guard, a language tutor. So many ways
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
to get the help that I needed. And then if you're
Yeah.
married, I think it's really important for couples to have a discussion together about how are we going to navigate this. It's really important, I
Yeah.
think, for both to learn the language and to engage in the culture. And that can
Mm-hmm.
often cause one of the two to slow down because you have to then
Yeah.
sacrifice for the other person. But we've just seen, and
Mm-hmm.
it is not the case for everybody, but we've seen a pattern where if one of the couples really advances quickly in language and culture adaptation,
Right.
the other one struggles forever to catch up and often gets discouraged. And so
Mm-hmm.
we encourage a couple at least to be constantly in conversation about what does the other one need to make sure they're thriving and progressing, whether it's a language
Yeah.
study or professional development or community building. That's really important. And learning the language
Yeah.
also is really important, and digging into the culture and the history and the
Huge.
geography and being like taking delight and enjoyment in learning about this new place. That's really important. And
Mm-hmm.
I've seen that also people who do that over time do really well, who start to appreciate the local sense of humor and who can tell you the
Mm-hmm.
historical, political history or point out the geographical
Yes.
monuments, and just really be excited about this new place you get to learn about. That's important. I'm trying to bring that
Mm-hmm.
back with me to Minnesota.
Yeah. Feel like we
Yep.
entered a whole new world. Yeah. Yeah, same. I feel like my experience with Uganda, I went, alone as a 24-year-old young woman, and I just felt very lost, for the first several months. And lonely. It felt really lonely, isolating, but like you said, just attempting, to learn the language, trying to appreciate the foods, the different music, everything that really, and of course I'd read all the political reports, and it helped me find a sense of home there. And I love that you mentioned about getting help, because that was huge for me too, hiring, someone to help with all the babies that we had in our house, and hiring someone to help with cooking and all that just really helped lighten some of the load, because obviously all those things that in America I could have done in an hour, laundry there takes, an entire day,
Yep.
there's no laundry machine, there's no washing machine. So yeah, I think that those things are very helpful. So great. Okay. Well, that really brought me to our ending point here. Is there any other, if you're talking to a young missionary and they're looking at you, they're like, Rachel, I'm going to this country. It's maybe a little bit hostile. I'm going to maybe a Muslim area or a very remote area, or maybe there's Taliban or anything like that. What can you say to someone like that? Any advice that you would give them, practices that you recommend that can really help them in those early days of their mission?
One thing that I think is important is that, especially someplace that is so different from what someone might be familiar with, there can be a sense in which I need, or also when it's potentially hostile, there's this sense, and partly true, that we need to adapt. But I think that can go too far sometimes. Like, yes, adapt. I mean, I did. I wore the headscarf. I ate the local food. I learned the local language. But sometimes this idea, as a Christian especially, I think as women too, we die to self, and we take that in all the way
Yeah.
to dying to everything that I am. Becoming all things to all people. We
Right.
can manipulate these and take it too far. These are beautiful, true, inspiring passages of Scripture, and yet God did not send a generic human body to these places, to the Taliban regions or to Somalia or to
Yeah.
Djibouti. He sent Rachel Jones to this place, and God made
Yes.
me in a particular way with particular interests and particular passions and a particular personality. And when we talk about dying to self or becoming all things, I think that means dying to the things that would inhibit my relationship with Jesus, that would, that become idols,
Yes.
but not dying to my love for running and my interest in literature, or
Yeah.
my interest in cooking or whatever it might be. That God has brought a unique person to these places, and I think learning how to celebrate who you are specifically in this place and finding a way to uniquely contribute as you is a gift to that community. And that's what I want
Yes.
from them too. When I meet someone from a different culture, I want to know who they are, not just a generic person from Taiwan or from Russia or whatever. I want to know your personality and how can we
Yes.
connect. So be wary of taking those beautiful spiritual truths too far, and then trust God for who you are in this place. That God will be with you and guiding you specifically. So that's one thing I would
Yeah.
encourage people to do. That just to to know yourself and to be able to be yourself
Yeah.
in this place. That's what will help
Yeah.
you be long
I
term.
really appreciate.
Just it helps you last if you
Yes.
just stifle all those things that give you joy, that are from God in who
Yes.
you are. If you stifle that, you will start to suffocate, and so it will help long term.
Yes. Totally. I completely agree. I really appreciate that you said that. I'm really a big proponent of knowing yourself and your identity and holding on to it, especially as a woman and a mother, where it's so easy just to abdicate who we are, to the needs of those around us. And so I think that's really true and really beautiful, and something that's really good advice for all our listeners. So this has been such an incredible conversation. I just really appreciate you being on the show. And I hope that if you're a missionary, this has helped you wrestle with the mystery of faith and other cultures. And Rachel, you're a delight. And if people want to connect with you to buy your books, where can they
So
find
my
you?
website is rachelpiejones.com. Pie is Pieh. And my books are available all the places books are sold. They're from Plow, so you can go to Plow Publishing and find them there, or request them from your local library. I love the library, so I encourage people to do that. Yeah, and I'm on all
That's great.
the social media places with Rachel Pieh Jones. Yeah.
All the socials. Nice. Okay. And yes, and your book Pillars, definitely you guys pick up a copy of that. That's going to be super helpful for you if you're navigating different cultures or expat life. And if you want to connect with me, you can go to my website, www.saritahartz.com, to get my new free ebook on reentry, or you can follow me on Instagram at Sarita Hartz. And thank you so much, Rachel,
Thank
for
you.
being here. And I hope we get to connect
Absolutely.
again soon.
Bye.
All right. Take care.